Before we begin the news, Joe, the president, well, this is a president who said, and I'll quote his words here, "You're going to have such great health care at a tiny fraction of the cost, and it's going to be so easy." That was October of 2016, Joe.
Well, you know, and Mark Halperin has said all along, the greatest risk to Donald Trump, the greatest risk to the Republican majority may not be the Russian scandals. It may not be the indiscriminate tweeting. It may not be the unpresidential behavior. It may not be the questioning of checks and balances. It may not be actually throwing aside every sacred tradition in the United States government over the past 240 years. It may be the inability to get things done, because Donald Trump's chief promise, above everything else, was, "I can make Washington work. It's broken, but don't worry, I'm a deal maker. This is easy. We're going to do so much, and we're going to win so much that you're going to get tired of winning." And what he's actually finding is, as somebody said earlier this morning, that it's much easier to stamp your name on buildings, on stakes, and on online university courses than it is to actually run Washington, D.C. and get significant legislation passed. And this was quite the failure, Mika, after he continued to promise he was going to get it done. And you remember the Rose Garden celebration a couple of months ago? The president forgot that you have to pass it through the House and the Senate. So this is doubly humiliating for him this morning.
And for everyone, really, because I'm not sure if this president thought that throwing a party like that perhaps would attract senators to jump on board. It's just all kind of seems like child's play, like he thinks this is child's play, and it's clearly failing at this point. Here's what we've got so far. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is pulling the plug on the Republicans' current plan to repeal and replace Obamacare. The news comes after Senators Mike Lee and Jerry Moran both announced their opposition to the legislation last night. With a 52-seat majority, Republicans could only afford to lose 2 votes, and Senators Rand Paul and Susan Collins had already said they would not support the bill for separate reasons. Last night, McConnell released a statement saying, in part, regretfully, it is now apparent that the effort to repeal and immediately replace the failure of Obamacare will not be successful. So in the coming days, the Senate will vote to take up the House bill, with the First Amendment order being what a majority of the Senate has already supported in 2015, and that was vetoed by then President Obama. A repeal of Obamacare with a 2-year delay to provide for a stable transition period. Shortly before that statement came out, President Trump tweeted, "Republicans should just repeal failing Obamacare now and work on a new health care plan that will start from a clean slate. Dems will join in." Earlier in the evening, President Trump held a dinner with several Republican lawmakers. Officials described it as a collaborative strategy session with senior members familiar with tough legislative battles. According to Politico, President Trump told Republicans at the dinner the party would look like, quote, dopes if they couldn't pass the health care bill after passing a repeal bill in 2015. After Senators Lee and Moran announced their opposition, Senator John McCain, who is recovering from surgery, released a statement calling for a bipartisan solution to health care. He said, in part, Congress must now return to regular order, hold hearings, receive input from members of both parties, and heed the recommendations of our nation's governors so that we can produce a bill that finally provides Americans with access to quality and affordable health care. Joe, this has been in the Republicans' laps for a long time. They've been saying they want to do this for years, and still nothing.
Well, still nothing, and one of the biggest problems actually for the Republicans is having a president that you just can't trust. You know, Chris Christie made the news yesterday by talking about how the meeting with the Russians probably was breaking the law. A lot of people said, well, that's revenge served up cold. Actually, Chris Christie is a perfect example of how disloyal Donald Trump is. Christie was the first to get out support Donald Trump. He was used and then abused on the vice presidency, strung out, told he would get the position of Attorney General. He didn't get that. And Mark Halperin, Republicans in the Senate are seeing that he did the same exact thing to all the Republican House members that he and Steve Bannon kept threatening and said, you better do this or else. Well, they pushed and got a House bill passed by the barest of margins in the U.S. House. And a month or two later, Donald Trump is calling it a, quote, mean bill. So when he says Republicans will look like dopes if they don't pass the legislation, that's what a lot of members, as you know, on Capitol Hill are saying this president looks like, because he can't be trusted. He hasn't shown any guidance on health care reform, and he's left them out there on their own. How bad of a day was it for Donald Trump yesterday when you had the health care legislation yanked, and then he wakes up this morning to a Wall Street Journal editorial that says that both he and his family faces certain destruction if they don't change their ways?
Well, the editorial's ominous, and obviously in the absence of a robust legislative agenda, all the controversy is going to get more attention. There are a lot of forward-looking questions about what happens with health care now. The backward-looking question, I think, revolves around this. There's never been as big a mismatch between the size of a legislative ambition and the small amount of effort the president put in. I'm sure the president thinks he worked really hard to pass it, but you think about what is normally required. If you're neither loved nor feared by members of Congress, you must energize your base in an overwhelming way through repeated public events, barnstorming the country, building coalitions. The president did a handful of events, gave almost no speeches about it, almost never tweeted about it. And the notion that he was going to do something that's very difficult to do, repeal an entitlement with the level of effort he invested in this, it was a huge mismatch between expectations and effort. And it does leave him, as you said at the top, in a position where if this somehow does not get turned around, and I don't see how it does now, how does he pass anything this year?
Well, Mark, you know, he actually, when he got involved, it seemed to be negative. We heard the stories a couple of weeks ago about how they were going to run attack ads against Dean Heller, a pro-Trump super PAC. That enraged McConnell and all of the senators. Now we're hearing he's possibly looking at funding a primary challenger for Jeff Flake. So he doesn't get involved that much. When he does, it's usually negative. And he just enrages senators who, again, are thinking what Lindsey Graham said, which is, if you think this president has your back, you're sadly mistaken. So they're not going to jump off the cliff for this guy.
No. You can rewrite, as an outsider, governors have shown this, you can rewrite some of the rule books of the Capitol, but you cannot repeal the laws of political physics, one of which is if you're trying to pass a bill with only Republican votes and you alienate the Republican Party, if they don't fear you and they don't love you, you're not going to pass anything. And this bill didn't get close. The two defections last night were just the two who decided to go first. But in the end, they were going to lose up to 15, I think, Republican senators. It leaves them in a horrible position in terms of how to deal with health care. But again, how does tax reform push off of this failure? How do you succeed in something in many ways more complicated, more a target of lobbyists, more divisive within the party, if you couldn't do something that every Republican who's run for office in the past 7 years pledged to do?
And he's not playing by the rules of Washington, Mike Barnacle. He's not playing by the laws of, not following the laws of Washington, the basic laws of how you get things passed. And people can want an outsider. Ronald Reagan was an outsider, but he brought in people that knew how to get things done. What have we been saying on this show for years? Washington always wins. It's a message we took to our friends in the Obama White House in early 2009 when they thought they could do it their way. Well, no, they realized that there are customs and there are ways to get things done in Washington, D.C. that you can't ignore. Let me read from the Wall Street Journal editorial again from this morning. Trump believes that his outsized personality and his social media following make him larger than the presidency. He is wrong. So says the Wall Street Journal, who usually is supportive of Mr. Trump, but certainly has turned the corner in this editorial. Mike? Donald Trump thought he could rewrite the laws of Washington. Washington is rolling over him right now.
Yeah, Joe, and the past 6 months, especially with regard to health care, has proven to be, I think, a blend of incompetence and cynicism. Incompetence at the level of the White House in terms of the president pushing health care legislation, and cynicism on the part of Mitch McConnell, who continually comes up with ways that he thinks will gather enough votes, 50, 51 votes in the Senate, to pass this, including some really toxic amendments. You get to the point where you wish that we in the media and the United States senators, all 100 of them, ought to be forced to answer the simple question, do you believe in effective and affordable health insurance coverage for every American? Yes or no? I mean, I think they ought to answer that now.
Yeah, they are answering in one way. I think it's a good question, because they're basically saying yes now, because the effort been put forward by the House and now the president pushing, and in whatever kind of compromises they tried to reach in the Senate, have demonstrated that Democrats and Republicans, but particularly Republicans, care about what Republican governors are believing. Look, I think this whole act with President Trump is getting tired. I mean, all of this, it's easy. We're going to have the greatest of this. We're going to have the most tremendous of that. The credibility is being strained on every level. McCain's statement, and it's been said and echoed on this panel many, many times before, the first thing this president should do now in health care is turn to the governors, Democrat and Republican alike. It would have been smart for him or smart for him to have gone and presented to that group and said, look, if we can't get this passed, can we work together? And finally, it was striking, I thought, Elon Musk came before the governors while they were there and laid out an innovation agenda and even pointed to some of the pitfalls and shortcomings and concerns around this growth in artificial intelligence, what it means. We've talked about it on this set before, what it means for employment, what it means for economic growth. And he talked about the regulatory envelope that needs to be put around this kind of growth and the kind of innovation that's happening in that space. You don't hear that from this president. And finally, this is unlike McConnell. McConnell is a legislator, and he normally gets things done. For him not to have gotten this done, this is a spectacular letdown for him. And you almost think that he must have some other agenda here. Is this an effort to try to begin working with Democrats, or to even pose the question that you posed so succinctly and eloquently a few minutes ago? What is it that we want, and how do we do it?
I don't know what McConnell's game plan is. I think there were a couple of problems here for sure. One, as we've talked many times, healthcare is a sixth economy. It's a big deal. And this bill was very far-reaching. It was too radical in terms of what the country, through their electeds, were willing to accept. And I think they just tried to get to a bridge too far. But secondly, vis-a-vis the president, it's typical, and I saw this happen when I worked in the White House in the Obama administration. When you want something done, yes, it's up to Congress, but you set up a war room in the White House, you put somebody on point, you say your job is to bird dog every single member and figure out what they need and how to get this done, and work it. I watched Rahm Emanuel do that on Obamacare in 2009. And these guys just kind of sat there and said, well, you know, they'll figure it out, or I'll play golf with Rand Paul, or I'll have dinner with a few of these guys one night, and it'll all work itself out. And that's just not how it happens up there.
This is true.
Yeah, and I think, Harold, that's the greatest misunderstanding. Donald Trump thinks he can throw a ceremony in the Rose Garden and impress members of Congress. And truth be known, this is what all presidents do. George W. Bush came in, and the Bush administration, there weren't enough stories written about it. They had contempt for members of Congress and ignored. There were actually stories about how they ignored members of their own party for some time. That didn't last long. The Obama administration came in, and they certainly had a Democratic majority. But you know, White Houses always come in. They think that they've somehow cracked the code, and everybody's going to blindly follow them. This White House is just the absolute worst in that respect, Harold. They think that everybody's going to follow them, or they can be beaten up or intimidated. It's actually very, very hard work, isn't it? And you talk about Mitch McConnell. We've been saying this for months, that the more you give to the moderates in the Senate on Medicaid, the more conservatives you lose.
Right.
You don't get Susan Collins and Ted Cruz in the same bill. You probably don't get Rob Portman and Rand Paul in the same bill. The math never added up. They never had the map. Let me say it again, because they've been saying it since they've been debating this in the House of Representatives. Just like I told Donald Trump on this show repeatedly, don't pick fights with the intel community or go to war with the press. Let me say it again, Harold, and you can repeat it if you believe it. This health care bill has to be bipartisan.
No doubt about it.
There are not enough Republicans to pass the health care bill. I give that message as a public service to the Trump White House, which we've been saying for months, but they are too whatever to listen to the reality. Harold, the votes just aren't there. There aren't enough Republicans to pass this thing.
To build on that point, which I agree with, the point Michael made and Ratner as well, but Michael's point about have to ask the question, what is it that we want? Affordable, available health care, and let's start there and attract Democrats and Republicans. Republicans throughout Congress and throughout Washington criticize Obama for basically ramming through a health care bill that only enjoyed Democratic support. Steve is right. They did put an organizational piece in the White House together, but they had the numbers, much like Republicans have the numbers now to do it, but they just can't seem to pull it all together. To get this done, it's been said here on the show many times, you've got to make it bipartisan. In fact, you can start with governors. Let them lay out what's working and what's not, and let Democrat and Republicans alike react to that. I think you would find 5 to 10 Democrats that would come to work with Republicans if they were genuine and sincere and serious about getting something done.
Absolutely nothing about this process worked. I want to get to Julie Pace and talk about what's going on inside the White House. I hear Sean Spicer is back, had one hell of a press briefing yesterday, which we'll get to next block. But Julie, is there any concept from the people that you talk to inside the White House that this wasn't going well and that this is bad? I mean, what's the mindset?
There tend to be 2 camps on these types of issues, and this proved to be true in the healthcare debate. You have the one camp that truly believes to the end that the power of the president, his ability to go after lawmakers on social media, the base that he has that remains loyal will be a powerful factor in moving some lawmakers. But you do have other folks in the White House who knew that this was not looking good. They were up on the Hill talking to senators, and they just couldn't find a way, as Joe was saying, to put these pieces together if they were going to focus on a piece of legislation that was only going to rely on Republicans. It was almost impossible in the end to find that magic formula.
But Julie, I'm curious, because we're all sitting here watching this. We all saw this going down in flames long before it happened. Who's talking to the president before he gets out in front of the cameras at the White House with the vice president behind him saying this is going to be good an hour before it goes down in flames? Like, does the right hand know what the left is doing at all? Is anybody speaking truth to this president? It's not even truth to power. Are they telling him what's going on so he doesn't look like an idiot?
Or even more stunningly, put him in a room with a bunch of senators last night as this was actually going down in flames, senators who were already supportive of the bill and weren't going to be the ones that he had to wrangle. Look, I think that you know this better than anybody. You can say anything to the president that you want. You can try to speak truth to power. He will get up there and say something completely different if he feels that way. And I think for him, again, he either truly believed that this was moving in a different direction than it was, or he was going to put on a happy face about it until the very end. And you saw last night, after this did go down in flames, now he's out there talking about repeal. I think it's important to remember that at the beginning of the year, there were some lawmakers, Republicans, who thought that maybe a straight repeal package was the way to go. Part of the reason that they moved away from that is because it was President Trump, President-elect Trump during the transition in particular, who said, no, we need to do repeal and replace.
And Mark Halpern, now, if that's their backup plan, good luck getting that passed as well. Susan Collins will be a no. And again, you go back to the same moderate Democrats that aren't going to be able to run for election, are the moderate Republicans, saying that they slashed Medicaid and they slashed these benefits and that 25 million people will be pushed off of health insurance coverage. But, Mark, I want to follow up on what Miko was saying to Julie. There's just this remarkable disconnect from the realities of Washington. Whenever you talk to people inside the Trump White House, they all say, oh, it's going to be fine. They've always said for 6 months, everything's fine. This is going perfect. You people just don't understand. No, we're playing to our base, but we're going to win this vote. And you know, they have been saying all along. You know, it's like, actually, I think the perfect summation of it would be Reince Priebus's Sunday morning performance when he called the Don Jr. meeting a nothing burger. That is their attitude towards everything. They're always proven wrong. They've been proven wrong on Russia. They're proven wrong on health care. And the question is, will they ever right the ship? Or will they keep, again, as the Wall Street Journal said this morning, keep playing to their base and stay at 36%?
Well, and they didn't even energize the base very much to try to pass health care. You could imagine them putting pressure on a senator from Kansas, a senator from Utah, by energizing the base and say this must pass. So if you add up their liabilities now and you add up the things they have going for them, they're not in a great place with the investigations. They've got to raise the debt ceiling. That's going to be super complicated. They've got to pass a budget. Those three things are going to take up a lot of space in the wake of a failure of health care, an attempt to pass tax reform. I'll say again, they're looking at a limited legislative calendar with Congress, whether they stay in for August or not. How are they going to pass any major bill in his first year at this point without making big changes? And I don't see any indication of big changes because, as you suggested, they think they're right. They believe their own talk often that things are going great. Last night was an ominous sign, and it leaves them with no clear path forward now to achieve something big this year.
Oof, what's it going on? What's it like in there this morning? Still ahead on Morning Joe, we hadn't seen Sean Spicer in weeks at the White House podium. Maybe that's why he was giving old talking points on Donald Trump Jr.'s meeting at yesterday's briefing, really old ones. But you couldn't see his face, but we'll play it for you. We'll also bring in members of the two congressional intelligence agencies investigating Russia, Senator Joe Manchin and Congressman Jim Himes.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.